The rain poured down in heavy sheets, soaking through the thin jacket Daniel wore as he stood outside the convenience store. He shivered, pulling his hood lower over his face. For the last 20 minutes he had been standing in the cold, watching customers come and go. Not a single person had acknowledged him, not even a glance. He had seen it before, the way society looks right through people like him. Or at least, the way people thought they were looking at someone like him. Because what none of them knew, Daniel wasn't actually homeless. He was the owner of this entire store chain. And tonight he was here to learn something about the people he employed. What kind of employees had he hired? Did they actually care about people, or were they only here for the paycheck? Daniel was about to find out, but what he didn't realize was that one employee was about to change everything, and it was someone he least expected. It all started a week ago. Daniel Carter had built one of the largest convenience store chains in the country. But success had come with a cost. As the company grew, he became more distant from the stores themselves. He spent his days in a corporate office, buried in spreadsheets and sales reports. He thought things were going well, until an anonymous letter landed on his desk. The letter changed everything. It was from a former employee, someone who had worked at one of his stores for 3 years before finally quitting out of frustration. Daniel read the letter once, then again, and with each word his stomach sank deeper. Your company doesn't care about people anymore. Employees treat customers like they're nothing, especially if they do look like they have money. The only thing that matters here is profits, and the people running your stores, they've stopped caring about anything else. Daniel gritted his teeth. He had built this company with a different vision. He had started with one small store, working the register himself, making sure everyone, rich or poor, felt welcome. Had things really changed that much? Had his company become cold? Daniel needed to know the truth, and he knew exactly how to find out. That's what brought him here, standing in the cold rain, dressed in ragged clothes, testing his own employees. The first person he approached was a cashier standing near the entrance. A young man in a crisp uniform scrolling through his phone. Daniel took a shaky breath and stepped forward. "Excuse me, sir," he started, his voice quiet, shaking from the cold. The cashier barely looked up. "Store's open if you're buying something," he muttered. Daniel swallowed hard. I don't need much, maybe just some hot coffee. I don't have enough right now, but..." The cashier sighed dramatically and looked up. "Listen, man, I don't have time for this. You either have money or you don't." Daniel's stomach tightened. He had expected some employees to be indifferent, but this... The cashier looked at him like he was less than human. Like he was just another problem to ignore. Daniel nodded slowly and stepped back. All right, that was one employee down, but he wasn't finished yet. He tried again with another worker inside, a manager stocking shelves. "Excuse me," Daniel said hesitantly. The manager barely glanced at him. "Can't help you," he said bluntly. Daniel frowned. Sir, I'm working. Unless you're buying something, I suggest you move along." Daniel's blood boiled. Was this really how they treated people? How many real homeless people had been ignored just like this? How had his company become this heartless? He was about to leave when a voice cut through the silence. "Hey!" Daniel turned. A young woman in a store uniform stood behind the counter. She had been watching the whole time. Unlike the others, she didn't look annoyed. She looked concerned. She quickly grabbed something from under the counter, a cup of hot coffee. She walked straight over to him and handed it to him. "Here, it's on me." Daniel hesitated. I don't have any money," he mumbled, sticking to his role. The woman smiled softly. "That's okay. You don't need money to deserve kindness." Daniel felt his chest tighten. He took the cup, his hands still shaking from the cold. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman smiled. "No problem. My name's Sophie. Let me know if you need anything else." Daniel stared at her. She had no idea who he was. No idea that he was testing the entire store, but she had passed with flying colors. She was the only one who had. And tomorrow she was going to find out the truth, because Daniel Carter wasn't just a homeless man standing in the cold. He was her boss, and she had just changed the course of her life forever. Daniel sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel, his mind still replaying the events from the night before. Sophie had been the only one who treated him with kindness. One employee. Out of an entire staff, she was the only one who had stopped, looked at him like a person, and helped him. It wasn't just frustrating, it was infuriating. How had his stores gotten to this point? How many customers had been treated like they didn't matter? Daniel exhaled slowly. He had his answer. Now it was time for them to get theirs. That morning he walked into the store, not as a homeless man but as the CEO. He wore a sharp navy blue suit, polished shoes, and his usual air of authority. This time employees noticed him immediately. Cashiers straightened up. Managers fixed their name tags. It was funny, really. The same people who ignored him last night were now scrambling to impress him. Daniel walked straight to the counter, where Sophie was ringing up a customer. She glanced up and gave him a polite, professional smile. "Good morning." "Welcome to," then she froze. Her eyes widened slightly as if she recognized him. But that was impossible, wasn't it? Daniel smiled. "Good morning, Sophie." The way her name rolled off his tongue so easily made her pause. Do I know you?" she asked, confused. Daniel's smile widened. "You helped me last night." Sophie blinked. "Wait, what?" Before she could process what was happening, the store manager, the same one who had ignored Daniel last night, rushed over. "Mr. Carter, what a surprise," he said, grinning. Daniel turned, raising an eyebrow. "Surprised to see me?" The manager chuckled nervously. "Of course not. We just weren't expecting a visit from the CEO today." Daniel folded his arms. "Yes, well, I had a rather interesting experience at this location last night." The manager's smile faltered. Daniel let the silence linger before continuing. "Let's talk in your office." The manager swallowed hard. "Oh, of course, sir, right this way." Daniel turned back to Sophie. "Sophie, I'd like you to join us." Sophie blinked again. "Me?" Daniel nodded. "Yes, you." She hesitated but followed. She had no idea what was about to happen, but something told her this wasn't just a normal meeting. Inside the manager's office, Daniel took a seat at the desk. The manager sat across from him, visibly sweating. Sophie sat quietly in the corner, still trying to process everything. Daniel exhaled. "Let's cut to the chase. Do you recognize me?" The manager stiffened. "Of course, Mr. Carter." Daniel leaned forward. "No, I mean, do you recognize me from last night?" Silence. The manager's face paled. Daniel smiled. "Gotcha. Let me refresh your memory," Daniel continued. "Last night I came into this store dressed differently. I wasn't in a suit. I wasn't the CEO. I was just a guy in need of a little help." The manager looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. Sophie's eyes darted between them, her confusion deepening. "And do you know what happened?" Daniel asked. The manager didn't answer. Daniel turned towards Sophie. "Sophie, can you tell me what you did last night?" Sophie hesitated. I gave you a coffee." Daniel nodded. "That's right. Because out of every employee in this store, you were the only one who treated me like a person." Sophie's eyes widened. Realization hit her all at once. The man she had helped was her boss. The manager stammered. "Sir, Daniel cut him off. "Tell me something," he said, voice sharp. "If I had actually been homeless, if I had been a regular customer in need, would you have treated me any differently?" The manager had no answer. Because they both knew the truth. "That's what I thought," Daniel said coldly. Silence. Then he turned back to Sophie. "Sophie, I brought you in here because I want you to hear this firsthand." Sophie straightened. "Hear what?" Daniel smiled. "That I'm promoting you." The room froze. Sophie stared at him. "Wait, what?" The manager choked on air. "You're what?" Daniel leaned back. Sophie, starting today, you are now the new assistant manager of this store. Sophie's mouth fell open. But I've never been a manager before. Daniel smirked. Neither had I before I became one. Sophie couldn't believe it. One simple act of kindness, and it had changed her entire life. The manager was fuming. Sir, this is highly unprofessional. Promotion should be based on experience. Daniel's smile vanished. Experience. You mean like the experience you showed last night? The experience of ignoring customers, of treating people like dirt. The manager's face turned red. Sophie showed more leadership in 5 minutes than you have in years. Daniel stood up. Pack your things, you're done here. The manager's jaw dropped. You're firing me. Daniel didn't even blink. Effective immediately. The manager was speechless. Sophie, still in shock, turned to Daniel. I don't know what to say. Daniel smiled. Then don't say anything. Just keep being the kind of person this company needs. Sophie nodded, determined. She had been given an opportunity she never saw coming, and she wasn't going to waste it. That evening, Daniel stood outside the store, watching as employees adjusted to the change. For the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. Sophie was going to do great things, and as for him, he wasn't just going back to his office. No, this undercover experience had opened his eyes. There was still work to do, and Daniel Carter was just getting started. Sophie still couldn't believe what had happened. 1 minute she was a cashier, just another employee trying to do her job. The next, she was the new assistant manager, and it wasn't because of experience. It wasn't because of some test or corporate review. It was because she had shown kindness. But now, as she stood in the back office with a crisp new name tag pinned to her shirt, reality was starting to set in. Could she really do this? Daniel stood beside her, watching as employees moved around the store, adjusting to the sudden shift in management. Sophie followed his gaze. Some employees seemed relieved, especially those who had been treated poorly under the old leadership. But others, they weren't happy. Sophie could feel their stares, hear the whispers. She's never even been a supervisor before. Why did she get the job over me? This isn't fair. Sophie swallowed hard. Daniel noticed. Nervous, he asked. She let out a small laugh. Is it that obvious? Daniel smirked. A little, but it's normal. Leadership isn't about knowing everything from day one. It's about learning and adapting. Sophie sighed. What if they don't respect me? Daniel turned to her. Then earn it. Sophie blinked. How? Daniel nodded toward the employees. Start by showing them you're in this with them. Work alongside them. Show them you care. The respect will come. Sophie let his words sink in. She had been given an opportunity. Now it was up to her to prove she deserved it. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. It was time to get to work. The first thing Sophie did, she rolled up her sleeves and joined the team. While some assistant managers preferred to stay in the office, handling paperwork, Sophie was out on the floor, helping stock shelves, assisting customers, and working side by side with employees. At first, people were skeptical. Louis, one of the cashiers, watched her closely. You don't have to do all that, you know, he said as she helped him bag groceries. Sophie shrugged. Why not? Louis raised an eyebrow. Because assistant managers don't usually do this kind of stuff. Paul never did. Sophie smirked. Well, I'm not Paul. Louis studied her for a moment, then nodded. Good, he was a jerk. Sophie laughed. That was one employee warming up to her, but she still had a long way to go. Not everyone was on board with the changes. Sophie quickly realized that some employees, especially those who had been close with Paul, weren't happy with the new leadership, and no one was more vocal about it than Tina. Tina had been working at the store for nearly 5 years. She was older, experienced, and well-respected among the team. And she was not shy about her opinion. I don't get it, Tina muttered one afternoon while stocking shelves. I've been here longer than Sophie. I've trained half the people in this store, and yet she gets the promotion. Sophie, who had been passing by, heard every word. She could have ignored it, could have pretended she didn't hear, but instead, she walked right up to Tina. "You're right," Tina blinked. "What?" Sophie met her gaze. "You have more experience than me. And you've trained a lot of people here. You probably deserve this job." Tina crossed her arms. "So why did you get it?" Sophie didn't flinch. "Because I did something no one else did. I showed kindness when no one was watching." Tina's eyes narrowed. "You think kindness makes you a leader?" Sophie smiled. "I think it's a big part of it." Silence. Then Sophie extended a hand. "Look, Tina, I'm not here to fight with you. I know you're good at what you do, and I want you to help me make this place better." Tina hesitated. She glanced at Sophie's outstretched hand, then sighed. "All right, boss, let's see what you've got." Sophie grinned. She had just earned an ally. Over the next week, the store began to feel different. The energy had shifted. Employees were starting to trust Sophie's leadership. Customers noticed the difference, and even the sales reports showed improvement. Then one afternoon, the last person Sophie expected walked through the doors. Daniel Carter. Sophie rushed over. "Mr. Carter." "What are you doing here?" Daniel smirked. "Just checking in. How's the transition going?" Sophie exhaled. "It's been a lot, but I think I'm finally getting the hang of it." Daniel studied the store. Employees were engaged. Customers were being helped. The tension that once clouded the store was gone. "I can see that," he said. Then he pulled out an envelope and handed it to her. Sophie frowned. "What's this?" "Open it." She did, and her eyes widened. It was a bonus check. More money than she had ever seen on a paycheck before. She looked up at him, speechless. "You earned it," Daniel said. Sophie felt her throat tighten. She had never expected any of this. All she had done was help someone in need, and it had changed her entire life. She swallowed hard and smiled. "Thank you, Mr. Carter." Daniel shook his head. "Don't thank me, just keep proving why I made the right choice." Sophie nodded. She would. Because this was just the beginning. She wasn't just a cashier anymore. She was a leader, and she was ready for whatever came next. Sophie sat at her desk. Even after a week as assistant manager, it still felt unreal. The past few days had been a whirlwind. She had gone from being just another cashier to leading a team of employees, some of whom didn't think she deserved the job. She had spent the last week proving them wrong. Now she was about to face her biggest challenge yet. It started with an angry customer. Sophie was in the back office, reviewing schedules, when she heard yelling from the front of the store. She rushed out to find a furious man standing at the counter, slamming his receipt onto the register. Louis, the cashier, looked completely overwhelmed. "Sir, this is ridiculous," the man snapped. "You overcharged me. I want a manager." Sophie stepped forward. "I'm the manager on duty. What seems to be the problem?" The man turned his glare toward her. "I bought 3 items and I was charged for 4. You guys are stealing my money." Sophie took the receipt and examined it. Then she scanned the items in his bag, and immediately she saw the issue. "Sir, you actually did purchase 4 items," she said, holding up a small pack of gum. "It looks like this was scanned separately." The man's face turned red. "I didn't buy that." Louis hesitated. "Sir, I remember you grabbing it from the counter. You placed it on top of the other items. Are you calling me a liar?" Sophie took a breath. This was exactly the kind of moment that defined leadership. "Stay calm, keep control, diffuse the situation." "Not at all," she said smoothly. "But I want to make sure you leave satisfied. I can offer you a refund on the gum, no problem." The man glared at her for a moment. Then, with a grunt, he snatched his money off the counter. "Next time, maybe train your cashiers to do their jobs properly," he snapped before storming out. The entire store was silent. Sophie turned back to Louis, who looked completely shaken. "You okay?" she asked. Louis exhaled. "Yeah, I just hate when people act like that." Sophie nodded. "I know, but you handled it well." Louis gave her a small, appreciative smile. Sophie turned to the rest of the staff, who had been watching the situation unfold. "Let me make something clear," she said. "I will always back you up when you're doing the right thing. If a customer is rude, you don't have to take it. You deserve respect." A few employees exchanged looks. This was not something they had ever heard from management before, and for the first time, Sophie felt like they were truly starting to trust her. But not everyone was convinced. Later that day, as Sophie stocked shelves, Tina approached her. "You really think you're going to change things around here?" Tina asked, crossing her arms. Sophie glanced at her. "I already have." Tina smirked. "One bad customer doesn't mean you're suddenly the best boss ever." Sophie chuckled. "I never said I was, but at least I care." Tina studied her for a moment, then with a shrug she walked away. Sophie sighed. Tina was warming up to her, but it would take more time, and Sophie was willing to put in the work. That evening, just as the store was about to close, something unexpected happened. Daniel Carter walked in. Sophie looked up from her clipboard, surprised. "Mr. Carter," Daniel smiled. "Just checking in. How's my assistant manager doing?" Sophie grinned. "I think I'm finally getting the hang of it." Daniel smirked. "Good. Because I have something for you." Sophie frowned. "What do you mean?" Daniel handed her an envelope. Sophie opened it and gasped. Inside was a bonus check, a big one. "This is way more than I expected," she stammered. Daniel chuckled. "That's because you're doing way more than I expected." Sophie felt her chest tighten. For years she had worked hard, hoping someone would notice, and now someone had. She swallowed hard. "Thank you, Mr. Carter, really." Daniel smiled. "Don't thank me yet, I have another challenge for you." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "Oh," Daniel leaned in. "I want you to help me fix more stores." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. "Wait, what?" Daniel nodded. "I want to take what we've done here and bring it to every store in this district. Better management, better training, better culture." Sophie was speechless. "Are you serious?" Daniel smirked. "Completely. So what do you say?" Sophie didn't even have to think about it. "I'm in." Daniel grinned. "I knew you would be." Sophie felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just about this one store anymore. This was about changing everything, and she was ready. Later that night, as Sophie locked up the store, she took a deep breath. She had started this job as just another cashier. Now she was about to change the entire company, and she couldn't wait to get started. Because this was just the beginning. Sophie sat at her desk, staring at the list of stores in front of her. Each location was circled in red. Each one was a problem store. Stores with bad customer service, high employee turnover, and management issues. Daniel Carter had given her a challenge to fix them, and Sophie wasn't going to back down. But she knew this wasn't going to be easy. Some of these stores had been operating the same way for years. Managers wouldn't be happy about an outsider coming in and telling them how to run things. Employees wouldn't trust her right away. But Sophie didn't care. She had a plan, and she was ready to execute it. The first store on her list was Brooklyn Avenue. According to reports, this location had some of the worst customer complaints in the district. Employees were unhappy. The manager, a man named Greg, known for being short-tempered and dismissive. Sophie arrived early, wearing her assistant manager uniform instead of business attire. If she was going to fix this store, she needed to blend in first. She stepped inside and immediately noticed the tension. Employees looked exhausted. The store was messy, shelves half-stocked, and the customers, they looked just as unhappy. Sophie took a deep breath. Time to get to work. Her first stop, talking to the employees. She approached a cashier, a teenage girl who looked nervous and overworked. "Hey there," Sophie said with a smile. The girl gave a hesitant nod. Hi, what's your name?" "Maya." "Nice to meet you, Maya. How long have you worked here?" Maya shrugged. "A few months, but I don't know if I'll stay much longer." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "Why, that?" Maya glanced around, then lowered her voice. "This place is a mess." The manager barely talks to us unless he's yelling. Half the staff already quit and the rest of us are just waiting for an excuse to leave. Sophie nodded. She had expected this. But hearing it firsthand, it still hit hard. Maya hesitated before adding, "Wait, you're not a secret corporate person, are you?" Sophie smirked. "Something like that." Maya's eyes widened. "Oh, so you're here to fix things?" Sophie nodded. "That's the plan." Maya let out a small laugh. "Good luck, you're gonna need it." Sophie just smiled. "I like a challenge." The next step, meeting Greg. She found him in his office, feet up on the desk, scrolling through his phone. He barely glanced up when she knocked. "Yeah," Sophie stepped inside. "Greg, right?" He sighed, finally looking at her. "Who's asking?" "Sophie, I was sent to check in on this store." Greg rolled his eyes. "Oh, great. Another corporate babysitter." Sophie smirked. "Not quite, I'm here to help." Greg leaned forward. "Listen, I don't need some outsider coming in and telling me how to do my job. I've been running this store for years." Sophie folded her arms. "Yeah. And in those years, how many employees have quit?" Greg hesitated. "How many customer complaints have been filed?" Sophie continued. Greg's jaw clenched. "You don't know what it's like to deal with these people. The employees here are lazy. The customers complain no matter what you do. You can't fix it." Sophie leaned in. "No, Greg, you can't fix it, but I can." Greg's face turned red. Sophie didn't back down. "Here's the deal. I'm going to work with this team and we're going to turn this place around. You can either get on board or you can get out of the way." Silence. Then Greg stood up, scoffing. "Fine, do whatever you want, but don't expect miracles." He brushed past her and left the office. Sophie exhaled. Greg wasn't going to make this easy, but she didn't need his permission to do her job, and she was just getting started. The next few days were intense. Sophie rolled up her sleeves and worked side by side with the team. She helped restock shelves, train employees, and set new expectations for customer service. Some employees were hesitant at first, but as they watched Sophie work just as hard as them, they started to trust her. Even Maya seemed a little more hopeful. "You're actually serious about fixing this place, huh?" she said one afternoon. Sophie grinned. "Dead serious." The turning point came when a customer incident tested everything. A man walked in, frustrated about a return policy. Greg was about to brush him off, but Sophie stepped in first. She listened. She didn't dismiss him. She offered a solution, not an excuse, and just like that, the man left satisfied. The employees noticed. Greg noticed too. And for the first time, he actually seemed to rethink his attitude. At the end of the week, Sophie gathered the employees for a meeting. "Listen, I know this store has had problems," she said, "but that changes now." She looked around at the team. "I need all of you to help me make this work. If we create a better store, we get better results. That means customers are happier, management is less stressed, and your jobs become easier." Maya raised an eyebrow. "So, you're saying if we work harder, we'll actually be appreciated?" Sophie smiled. "Exactly." There was a shift in the room. For the first time, employees actually seemed invested. And Greg, he stayed quiet, but Sophie could tell something in him had changed. Maybe he wasn't ready to admit it yet, but he was starting to see that her way worked. And that was the first step. That night, as Sophie drove home, her phone buzzed. A text from Daniel Carter. "Saw the reports, impressive work." "Keep it up," Sophie smiled. One store down, more to go, and she wasn't stopping anytime soon. Because now, she wasn't just fixing stores, she was changing the company, and this was just the beginning. Sophie had done what most people thought was impossible. She turned around one of the worst performing stores in the district. The Brooklyn Avenue location, once a mess of unhappy employees and frustrated customers, was now running better than ever. Sales had gone up. Customer complaints had dropped significantly, and the employees, they actually seemed happy to be there. Even Greg, the stubborn manager who had fought her every step of the way, was beginning to change his attitude. But there was no time to celebrate, because Sophie's next challenge was already waiting. She sat in her car outside her next target, Grandview Plaza. This store wasn't just struggling. It was on the verge of shutting down. Low sales, massive employee turnover, and worst of all, a general manager who had completely checked out. According to reports, the store's manager, Tom Reynolds, barely showed up. When he did, he stayed in his office all day, ignoring customers and employees alike. It was clear this store had no leadership, and if Sophie didn't fix it, it wouldn't survive another 6 months. She took a deep breath. Time to get to work. The moment Sophie stepped inside, she could feel the difference. This store didn't just feel poorly managed, it felt abandoned. The shelves were half empty. Customers wandered the aisles looking frustrated. And the employees, most of them were standing around, barely working. There was no energy, no urgency, no care. Sophie spotted a cashier leaning against the counter, scrolling on his phone. She approached him. "Excuse me, can I speak to the manager?" she asked. The cashier barely looked up. "Tom's in his office." But good luck getting him to come out. Sophie's stomach tightened. This was worse than she thought. Sophie marched straight to Tom's office. She knocked. No response. She knocked again, louder. Still nothing. Finally, she just pushed the door open. Tom was sitting at his desk, feet propped up, watching a video on his computer. He glanced up at her. "Who are you?" Sophie folded her arms. "The person who's about to fix this disaster of a store." Tom blinked. "Excuse me." Sophie stepped inside. "Let's cut to the chase. This store is failing. Customers are unhappy. Employees don't care. And you?" She gestured at his desk. "You're sitting in here watching videos instead of running it." Tom looked annoyed. "Look, I don't know who sent you, but I don't need some corporate babysitter telling me how to do my job." Sophie smirked. "Funny, because from what I can see, you're not actually doing your job." Tom sat up, glaring. "I've been running this store for 10 years. I know how things work." Sophie leaned forward. "Then explain to me why it's failing." Tom had no response. Sophie shook her head. "You've given up, haven't you?" Tom's jaw tightened. Sophie sighed. "Look, I get it. You've been here a long time. Maybe you stopped caring because you think corporate doesn't care about you." Tom looked away. Sophie pressed on. "But the truth is, your employees are following your lead. If you don't care, they won't care. If you're lazy, they'll be lazy. That's why this store is failing." Silence. Tom let out a slow breath. "What do you want from me?" Sophie smiled. "I want you to remember why you started this job in the first place, and I want you to actually start leading again." Tom studied her for a long moment. Then, finally, he nodded. "All right, what's the plan?" Sophie grinned. "Let's start by getting you out of this office." Over the next few days, Sophie completely overhauled the way the store ran. She started by working directly with the employees. Just like at Brooklyn Avenue, she got on the floor and worked side by side with them. She showed them how to restock shelves properly. She set new rules for greeting every customer who walked in. She even shadowed the cashiers to make sure transactions were smoother. And Tom, for the first time in years, he actually got involved. He started walking the floor, talking to employees, helping customers. It was clear Sophie's energy was rubbing off on him. And little by little, the employees began to follow. Then, just when things seemed to be improving, Sophie faced her biggest challenge yet. A corporate inspector arrived for a surprise visit. If the store failed the inspection, it would be put on a short list for closure. The pressure was on. Tom, now fully invested in saving the store, was panicked. "What if we're not ready?" he asked Sophie. Sophie stayed calm. "Then we do our best. We show them how much we've improved." When the inspector arrived, he was skeptical. He had visited this store before. He knew how bad it had been, but as he walked through the aisles, something was different. The shelves were fully stocked. The employees were actually working. And when he went to check out, a cashier greeted him with a smile. The inspector raised an eyebrow. "This isn't what I expected." Sophie smirked. What were you expecting? A mess, but instead I see progress. Tom exhaled in relief. The inspector made a few more notes on his clipboard, then turned to Sophie. I don't know what you did, but keep doing it. And just like that, the store was safe. That evening, Tom walked up to Sophie, shaking his head in disbelief. I don't know how you did it, he said. Sophie smirked. I didn't do it, you did. Tom laughed. No, you made me care again. And for that I owe you. Sophie smiled. Then do me one favor, keep this place running the right way. Tom nodded. You got it. Sophie looked around at the store, now completely transformed. It had taken hard work, patience, and a lot of tough conversations. But now, this place was alive again. And Sophie, she was ready for the next challenge, because there was still more work to do, and she wasn't stopping anytime soon. Sophie stood in the doorway of her office, staring at the email on her screen. Subject: Company-wide policy changes thanks to you. She took a deep breath and clicked it open. Sophie, because of the improvements you've made across our struggling locations, we're rolling out new policies company-wide. Fairer scheduling, better employee training, and a stronger emphasis on customer service. You didn't just fix stores, you changed the company. And for that, we owe you more than just gratitude. See me in my office tomorrow. We need to talk about your future. Daniel Carter. Sophie sat back in her chair, her heart pounding. It had started with one act of kindness. Now, she had transformed an entire corporation. A few months ago, she had been just another cashier. Now, she was the person who had saved multiple stores from closing. She had seen the worst of management, the neglect, the lack of leadership, the way employees were treated as replaceable, and she had changed it. At Brooklyn Avenue, she had restored trust and turned Greg from an arrogant, burnt-out manager into someone who actually cared. At Grandview Plaza, she had pulled Tom out of his rut, saving his store from being shut down. And because of those successes, corporate had finally paid attention. They weren't just listening, they were changing. And tomorrow, she was walking into Daniel Carter's office to find out what that meant for her. The next morning, Sophie stepped into the corporate headquarters for the first time. It felt intimidating. Massive glass windows, executives in sharp suits, people walking fast like every second counted. She adjusted her blazer and walked toward the receptionist. I have a meeting with Daniel Carter, she said. The woman nodded. He's expecting you, go right in. Sophie took a deep breath and stepped through the office doors. Daniel was at his desk reviewing papers. When he saw her, he grinned. There's my superstar. Sophie chuckled. Superstar, I'm just doing my job. Daniel leaned back. If every employee did their job like you, I wouldn't need to call this meeting. Sophie raised an eyebrow. So, what is this about? Daniel studied her for a moment. Sophie, you've done more for this company in a few months than some people do in years. You didn't just fix stores, you built a system that works. And now I want you to take that system company-wide. Sophie's stomach flipped. What are you saying? Daniel slid a folder across the desk. She picked it up and read the title, Vice President of Store Operations Promotion Proposal. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She looked up. This is a joke, right? Daniel smirked. I don't joke about business. Sophie blinked. Vice President of the entire company. Daniel held up a hand. Before you say anything, let me explain why I'm offering you this. Most people in corporate work their way up from behind a desk, but you worked your way up from the floor. You know exactly what's wrong with this company because you lived it, and now you're the best person to fix it. Sophie's hands shook slightly as she set the folder down. This is huge. Daniel nodded. It is, but you earned it. Sophie took a deep breath. She thought about everything that had brought her here, getting ignored as a cashier, being the only one to help a homeless man, finding out he was actually her boss, being thrown into management, proving herself over and over again. And now, she was about to lead the entire company's operations. She looked at Daniel and nodded. I'll do it. Daniel grinned. I knew you would. Over the next few months, Sophie completely transformed the company. She put together a new training program for managers, one that focused on leadership, respect, and employee engagement. She implemented a bonus system for stores that improved their customer satisfaction and employee retention. She made sure every employee, from cashiers to stock workers, had a voice. And the results? Incredible. Employee turnover dropped by 40%, customer satisfaction skyrocketed, and for the first time in years. The company wasn't just making money, it was building something meaningful, and Sophie was at the heart of it all. One evening, months later, Sophie visited her very first store. She walked inside, watching as employees greeted customers with genuine smiles. The atmosphere was completely different from when she had started. She saw Louis behind the counter. When he noticed her, he grinned. "Sophie, back to check up on us." She laughed. "Just making sure you guys haven't slacked off." Louis smirked. "Not a chance. You kinda made it impossible for us to go back to the old ways." Sophie smiled, feeling a sense of pride. She had changed things, for good. As she walked toward the exit, she heard a voice behind her. "Sophie?" She turned and saw Sophie's biggest critic, Tina. But instead of her usual skepticism, Tina looked different. "I just wanted to say you were right." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "Right about what?" Tina smirked. "That kindness makes a great leader." Sophie chuckled. "Took you long enough." Tina laughed. Yeah, don't let it go to your head." Sophie grinned. Too late. As she walked out of the store, she felt a sense of peace. This wasn't just about climbing the corporate ladder. It was about changing lives, and she had done that. For herself, for the employees, for the company, and most importantly, for the people who, like her, had once felt overlooked. She had given them a reason to believe things could be better. And now, she was just getting started, because this was only the beginning.